Here we have another landscape that was generated by Bomber Command and the Bureaucrene boys from the RAF. Just keeping their hand in after they've managed to bomb Syria to dust, Libya to dust, and Iraq to dust, and Afghanistan to dust. In fact, they have had a wonderful time since the end of World War II. They've now created the same landscape in the Middle East as they created in Germany, where they firebombed every city, illegally of course, because it was all war crimes, but they decided at the end of the war that only the Germans could be guilty of war crimes. So they did what they liked, as they are now, because you must do anything to save these poor Syrian people from that dreadful man Assad, who keeps dropping barrel bombs wherever they are. And I don't think anybody's ever seen a barrel bomb, but apparently Assad kept dropping them, and he kept carrying out chemical weapon attacks and gas attacks. When he was winning the war, he was giving the Americans excuses to invade his country, which they have done. The Americans have got thousands of soldiers stationed in Syria now, where they're intent on getting rid of Assad, and the fighting is picking up all over again. They have got absolutely no further excuse to continue the destruction of Syria. I mean, haven't they done enough? I mean, look at this. This is Dresden all over again. 300,000, 400,000 people burnt to death in Dresden. God knows how many in places like Frankfurt. I mean, they laid Germany to waste, and that was a white Christian country in the middle of Europe, and the British people destroyed it, completely destroyed it. And not only did they destroy it illegally, they declared the war on Germany. Germany didn't declare war on anybody. And now they're still, to cover up for the crime that they carried out against the German people, they still parade around on Remembrance Sunday, putting down flowers to the dead. I mean, it's disgusting. Those British soldiers were sacrificed for a lie. And now all these people from the Middle East, what's supposed to happen to them? I mean, they can't live here. There's no way they can survive in the middle of all this. And this is just, this is just part of the damage. This doesn't show you what's happened in Afghanistan, in Yemen, in Libya. I mean, it's happening everywhere, all over the Middle East. Now, nobody will ever convince me that the British government was trying to save anybody. The British people were destroying this country. This is total, deliberate destruction. And now this morning, the European Union, controlled by God knows who behind the scenes, nobody could tell you. If you ask anybody who controls the European Union, nobody knows. There's some hidden group of people behind it that hand out diktats, and the British and other governments just accept them. And it was this morning, or in recent days, there was an edict produced ordering all European member states to open their doors to immigrants and refugees. That was an order, and if they don't obey, there will be sanctions against them. So that means that people like Poland and Hungary will now be put on the rack to force them to accept the diktats of Europe. And it's as simple as that. I mean, in Mosul, where the people were told to stay in their homes, even as the British and others were bombing them, and the people were telling stories about how they'd see an ISIS somebody or other on the roof, waving his arms around, and then the house would be bombed, however many people were trapped inside. They said quite clearly that the British and Americans weren't bombing to save them, they were killing them, they were the target. I mean, look at this. This is Aleppo now. All those craftsmen working in this craft market. And now look what's happened to it. Even the savon d'Alep is being made in Tunisia now. I mean, this is scandalous. And the British set this ball in rolling when they wrote a letter which they call a declaration. Sounds posh, doesn't it? But it was just a letter, just a brief note telling Baron Rothschild that Palestine was his now. And the next thing was, immediately after the war, all the dead zombie Jews went rushing into Palestine with guns blazing, and they started the slaughter of the Palestinians, and the British were still there. They saw it all happening. They were being targeted themselves, but that was all kept quiet. I knew men that had been in Palestine in 1948, and they told me that everybody talks about how bad the Arabs are, and he said that we had no problem with Arabs, the problem was the Jews. And that was straight out of the mouth of an old man who'd served in Palestine in 1948. This man here, Hilary Benn, he's a socialist, and he comes from a family of politicians, basically. I believe his family made furniture or something, and he was married into the Wedgwood family that make pottery. And grandfather, father, and son were all politicians. Now, this is the last generation. He's the son of Anthony Wedgwood Benn, a man who is a member of the Tavistock Institute, which was all part of the plot to destroy family life and to destroy white people. Okay, now that is a fact, and that is written into the Tavistock's agenda. The same as they're members of the Fabian Society, and the aim of the Fabian Society is to get rid of the British people. They don't want a British people, they just want an homogeneous group with no particular culture, no particular history, nothing, just an homogeneous group, much like the blacks in America, if you like, but not black, of course, they have to be beige. But the blacks in America have got no culture, really, because whatever culture they had in Africa, they were obliged to leave behind when they were taken out of Africa. And they've got none. They never really produced anything that you could call culture while they were in Africa, and now they've got very little to show for the time they did spend in Africa, those thousands and thousands of years when they never so much as built. In the words of Pastor Mannings, a black preacher, they never even managed to build a 2-story building, but that's another story. Now they want everybody to be like, I suppose you could say, like a little bit like Brazil, where it's all basically slaves. Most of the slaves went to Brazil. You know, very few black slaves went to the United States. All we ever hear from are the black slaves from the United States and the West Indies. We don't hear about the millions of black slaves that went down into Brazil and into other countries. All we hear about is 400,000, I believe, went into America. And I'm not quite sure how many slaves actually came into the West Indies and the UK at the end of the war, but they've come in and they haven't actually constructed any sort of civilization or culture or whatever, I don't know. They can't even sing songs anymore. And they're talking about homogenizing the race. You won't homogenize the race, and I think they know that. I mean, there's enough evidence to show that you cannot homogenize races. They just aren't interested in mixing. People like to stay with their own kind. And there's nothing wrong with that. But when you bring in a big mix of different cultures, what you actually get is groups that will end up fighting each other. I've heard tales of, even in places like the jungle in Calais, where the various groups of people are fighting amongst themselves. They can't even get on together while they're all so-called refugees or immigrants. So God knows what it's going to be like. In London now, I've seen there's film on YouTube of groups of Muslims wandering around in the evening telling girls that aren't properly dressed to go home and get dressed. They're telling men who are sat in the park in the summer warmth, drinking a beer together, to stop drinking beer. And they're saying outright on film that what they want is all British girls to be wearing the burqa. And one of these characters, Chowdhury, the same name as the Anjem Chowdhury, is in jail at the minute. I mean, if he's supposed to be in jail at the minute, I prefer to think he's back home in that Tel Aviv, having a nice time while pretending to be in jail. But that's another story. Anyway, it seems to me that this Syrian crisis is going to go on to the bitter end. America seems to be intent on rekindling the war. And in fact, things are going nowhere.